In March 3, 1943, Bremen, Germany. The night was still, except for the soft hum of 1,000 machines sleeping beneath canvas and concrete. The air outside the research compound was cold enough to sting the lungs, but inside, under a flickering fluorescent lamp, Dr. Otto Weiss pressed his ear against the steel casing of a captured Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. He couldn't hear it, not in the way others could. Otto Weiss had been born tone-deaf. He could not tell a symphony from static, but he felt sound, in the bones, in the air, in the vibration of the walls. He closed his eyes, placed a hand on the engine's side and whispered, "You have a rhythm, don't you? A heartbeat." His assistant, a young Luftwaffe technician named Richter, frowned. "Herr Doctor, the mechanics have finished their report. The engine's sound is normal." Otto smiled faintly. "Normal," he repeated. "Nothing in war is normal, Richter. Every machine sings differently, and if you listen closely enough, it tells you who built it and where it's flying." Outside, the Allied bombers had begun their nightly raids again, the low drone of engines sweeping across the North Sea. The Reich's radar was too primitive to see them until it was too late. By the time sirens wailed, the firestorms had already begun. But Otto Weiss had an idea, not born from patriotism, but from obsession. He believed the human ear, aided by science, could do what radar could not, hear the enemy before they arrived. He started with recordings, hundreds of hours of captured sound from Allied bombers, Lancaster, Halifax, B-17, Flying Fortress. Each engine, each formation, created a different pattern of sound waves, the music of war. He used oscilloscopes and phonographs, turning the chaos of noise into lines on a screen. The frequencies formed shapes, like fingerprints, and in those shapes Otto found rhythm. A Lancaster droned in the low range, steady and deep, like the cello section of an orchestra. The B-17s sang higher, in a rough harmony of 4 engines beating slightly out of sync. The British Mosquito, fast and light, fluttered across the upper register like violins in a panic. He began charting them all. Each aircraft had a voice, and if he could teach his instruments to recognize those voices, the Reich would no longer be blind. 2 weeks later, in a bunker on the coast of France, Otto stood before a group of officers. A reel-to-reel player sat on the table beside him. He placed the needle and nodded to the technician. The room filled with the faint hum of distant engines, recorded the night before. "Listen," Otto said quietly. "That is not random noise. That is 12 Avro Lancasters flying in 2 V formations, altitude 6,000 meters, speed 280 kilometers per hour, target direction Essen." The officers looked skeptical. One of them, a gruff colonel, scoffed. "How can you know that? You're guessing?" Otto smiled again, just a little. "I am not guessing, Herr Oberst. I am listening." He motioned toward the equipment, a crude network of microphones and amplifiers connected by kilometers of wire. Every plane produces a unique tone, every squadron flies with its own rhythm, like an orchestra, and I am learning their symphony. The colonel crossed his arms. "And what do you propose we do with this music?" "We build more ears," Otto said simply. "A chain of listening posts across the continent, from Calais to Vienna. They will hear the bombers long before they reach our cities. We will know their routes, their numbers, even their factories of origin." For the first time, silence filled the room. Then the colonel gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "You want to save Germany with music?" Otto looked him in the eye. "With sound, Colonel, and sound moves faster than light." Weeks turned into months. The network grew. Towers, hidden in forests, microphones buried in fields, wires strung along telephone poles and church steeples. Otto named the project Klangnetz, the sound net. Every night, Allied bombers filled the sky, and every night his station sent coded reports. B-17 group detected, northwest approach, altitude low. Soon, German fighters began intercepting before radar even saw a blip. The generals were impressed. The propaganda ministry wanted to call Otto a scientific hero, but he refused every interview. He didn't care about fame, only about the music. He began hearing more in the recordings. Subtle, shifting harmonies. The Allies were changing something, different pitch, slightly slower rhythm. He knew it wasn't coincidence. Someone, somewhere, was trying to confuse him. And that's when the orders came from Berlin. Find whoever is conducting this countermeasure. Meanwhile, across the channel, in a dimly lit London office filled with radio static and cigarette smoke, another man was listening. Professor Arthur Pennington, once the conductor of the Royal Philharmonic, now working for British intelligence, sat hunched over a record player. He replayed the same German recording again and again. He could hear it instantly, the way the Luftwaffe was tracking them by sound. He picked up his pen and wrote a single note in his ledger. They are listening to us as if we are an orchestra. He smiled sadly. Then it's time to change the tune. Back in Bremen, Otto Weiss sat alone, exhausted, surrounded by reels of sound and tangled cables. Outside, the air raid sirens began to howl again. He turned off his lights, pressed his hand against the cold steel wall and listened. The bombers were coming, 1,000 engines singing across the night sky. He could feel their rhythm through his fingertips, and for the first time he thought he heard something different. Not the deep growl of Lancasters or the sharp pulse of B-17s. Something new, something out of tune. He closed his eyes. And in that discord, the war for the sky's symphony had just begun. In April 12, 1943, London, England, the rain over London fell softly that morning, like a tired metronome ticking over a forgotten score. Inside a small office on Baker Street, the smell of burnt coffee mixed with stale tobacco, and the faint hum of typewriters from the adjoining rooms. Professor Arthur Pennington sat at his desk, his white shirt wrinkled, his tie loosened. He stared at a gramophone spinning a vinyl record, another recording of the same Allied bomber formation intercepted by German listening posts. He closed his eyes and listened. To anyone else it was just engine noise, mechanical, dull, monotonous. But to Arthur it was something else entirely. It was music. He could hear the pattern, the four-engine harmony of a B-17 squadron, synchronized like instruments in an orchestra. Each slight variation in pitch revealed something: altitude, formation size, fuel load. And the Germans were listening. Arthur exhaled slowly and murmured, "He's clever. Whoever's out there, he understands rhythm." From the corner of the room, a younger intelligence officer, Lieutenant Sarah Whitby, looked up from her notepad. "You mean the German physicist, sir?" Arthur nodded. "Yes. He's building something remarkable. A sound-based early warning system. The Luftwaffe calls it Klangnetz." Sarah frowned. "And it works?" Arthur tapped the record player with a finger. "Too well. Our bomber groups are being intercepted before radar can even spot them. They're hearing us coming." He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "They're reading the symphony of our engines." Later that day, Arthur stood in a hangar at RAF Whiten, watching ground crews test run a B-17's engines. The roar filled the space, shaking his chest. He walked slowly around the aircraft, listening, not with his ears, but with his instincts. "Do you hear that?" he shouted to a mechanic. "The third engine, slightly higher pitch than the others." The mechanic shrugged. "It's within tolerance, sir. Doesn't make a difference in flight." Arthur smiled faintly. Not to us. But to them, it's a signature. He walked to the nose of the plane where the paint still bore soot from a recent raid. If we can change the music, we can change what they hear. Sarah, clipboard in hand, tilted her head. You mean, alter the engine sounds? Arthur nodded. Exactly, a counter-symphony. We make our engines sing in a different key, confuse their listening posts, make them think one formation is another, or that we're flying east when we're heading south. The mechanic laughed. So, you're going to fight the Germans with music, Professor? Arthur smiled, echoing words spoken months earlier in a room across the channel. With sound, Flight Sergeant, and sound moves faster than light. That night, Arthur returned to his small flat in Bloomsbury. The blackout curtains were drawn tight, but faint flashes from distant anti-aircraft guns still glimmered on the horizon. He set up a small turntable and placed a fresh record on it. He played 2 recordings, one from the German side, one from his own. He mixed them manually, spinning dials, altering speeds, overlaying frequencies. The sounds merged, metal, wind, thunder, and then, almost by accident, a pattern emerged. When 2 bomber groups flew at slightly offset speeds, their combined harmonics mimicked a third, entirely different aircraft type. Arthur sat up straight. "That's it," he whispered. "That's how we hide in plain sight." He grabbed his notebook and began sketching ideas. Engine timing adjustments, propeller blade alterations, modified exhaust tones. Each one was a note in his invisible symphony, a way to rewrite the sound of the sky. Over the next few weeks, small modifications were made to Allied aircraft under the cover of maintenance. Mechanics thought it was minor tuning. Pilots never noticed the difference. But high above the clouds, something changed. The German listening stations along the coast began reporting strange anomalies. B-17 formations detected, then vanished. Lancaster tone shifting, possible decoys. Multiple false echoes on the sound net. Dr. Otto Weiss sat in his command post in Bremen, staring at the waveform on his oscilloscope. The shapes were wrong, chaotic. The clean rhythms of Allied bombers had become discordant, shifting mid-flight like a melody gone mad. He rubbed his temples, frustration building. "They're changing their engines," he muttered. "No, they're playing us." He turned to his assistant. "Send word to every listening post. Begin recording all anomalies. If this is a countermeasure, we'll find its pattern." He leaned close to the speaker, listening. The static hissed like whispering ghosts. Somewhere beyond the white noise, he thought he heard faint music, mocking, taunting. Back in London, Arthur Pennington sat before a new recording, this time from a returning pilot. The man, still shaking from the mission, said, "The Jerrys didn't come up this time, sir. It was strange. We flew the same route as last week, but no interceptors." Arthur smiled tiredly. "They didn't hear you coming." Sarah grinned. "So the counter-symphony works?" Arthur's eyes softened. "For now, but they'll listen harder. The more we hide our rhythm, the more they'll search for it." He placed the record gently back in its sleeve. "War is no longer fought just with bombs or bullets, Lieutenant. It's fought with rhythm, silence, and deception." He looked toward the window, where dawn was breaking over the rooftops. "And somewhere out there, a German scientist is listening for us, just as I'm listening for him." He stood, straightened his jacket and whispered, then let the symphony continue. In 14th January 1943, somewhere along the frozen coast of Normandy, the sky sang before it killed. The German listening post stood on a windswept bluff above the sea, a cluster of antennas and parabolic dishes that looked like a forest of metal flowers. The air was sharp with salt and oil. Inside the bunker, banks of equipment hummed with life. Every sound from the night sky, The distant growl of engines, the echo of propellers over the channel, was caught, magnified, and written down in ribbons of thin, curling paper. Dr. Otto Weiss leaned over one of the reels, his thin fingers tracing the waveform as if it were a line of poetry. His uniform was neat, but his eyes were hollow from nights without sleep. He didn't look like a soldier. He looked like a man who had been listening to ghosts. "Another one?" asked his assistant, a young radio officer with trembling hands. Weiss nodded. "Yes, 4 engines, constant pitch, but listen here." He pointed to a faint oscillation, almost invisible. "Do you hear that pulse? It's not mechanical, it's human. Someone adjusted the mixture mid-flight." He lifted the headphones from his ears. "These are no ordinary bombers. This one sings in harmony." The young officer blinked. "Harmony?" Weiss gave a weary smile. "Yes, they are changing the frequency pattern, as if they know we are listening." He didn't say it aloud, but he could feel it. Someone on the other side of the channel was playing the same game. Someone with an ear as sharp as his own. Across the channel, in a dim office beneath the Ministry of Defense, Professor Arthur Pennington sat hunched over a gramophone. The air smelled of tobacco and cold tea. On the table lay dozens of phonograph records, each labelled with times, dates, and sectors: Norwich, Antwerp, Calais, Hamburg. He dropped the needle on a record. The low rumble of engines filled the room, a sound that most men would describe as identical. But not to him. To Pennington, each formation was a symphony. Every variation of pitch, every vibration in the harmonics, told him what kind of plane, what altitude, even what kind of fuel mixture was burning that night. He scribbled on a notepad, "Weiss has adjusted listening filters, high band capture. Must alter propeller syncopation pattern, add discord." He paused, tapping the pencil. Weiss. He didn't know the man's name, not officially, but he knew his ear. The pattern of the German interceptions had rhythm, the kind only a musician would understand. Someone over there was hearing the same music of war. Pennington turned to his aide, a nervous sergeant named Colin. "Tell Rolls-Royce to modify the Merlin engine tuning for the next batch of Lancasters. Shift resonance upward by half a semitone." The sergeant frowned. What, sir?" "Half a note, Colin. Just enough to make the Germans hear thunder where there's only silence." That night over the North Sea, the duel began in earnest. German operators listened through the hiss of static, noting every hum of engines crossing the water. But something was wrong. The frequencies no longer aligned with their charts. The bomber's signature had changed, the rhythm broken, the melody unrecognizable. Weiss adjusted the dials himself, his headphones clamped tight. "Nine, it's impossible. They've changed the key." The operator blinked. "The key, sir?" Weiss didn't answer. He was already scribbling notes. Mathematical, musical. The frequencies had shifted by precise ratios. It wasn't random. Someone was composing this chaos. As the night deepened, the British bombers reached their targets. Fire bloomed across the Ruhr Valley while, hundreds of miles away, Weiss replayed the recordings again and again, the faint tremor of admiration growing in his chest. Whoever was conducting the Allied flights understood harmony and counterpoint. He found himself smiling. The rare, almost childlike smile of a man meeting his rival through the music of war. Weeks passed. The duel became invisible but relentless. Pennington began to sleep in his office, surrounded by recordings. He was losing weight, his beard unshaven, his eyes hollow, yet alive. For every adjustment he made to the bomber formations, Weiss answered within days, refining his filters, correcting his readings. It was as though the two of them were performing a duet, a deadly symphony stretching across hundreds of miles of sky. When the RAF changed propeller synchronization, the Germans built microphones that separated harmonics by distance. When Pennington added distortion to disguise bomber altitude, Weiss invented algorithms to filter it out. Each victory was fleeting, each loss instructive. And through it all, Pennington kept thinking of the enemy not as a faceless scientist, but as a fellow musician trapped on the wrong side of the orchestra. In February, a snowstorm swept across the channel. Both men were awake that night, listening. Weiss sat in his bunker, his hands trembling as the microphones crackled with static. He heard something faint, a pattern. Not random, deliberate. A rhythm like Morse code, but more elegant, woven into the pulse of the engines. He scribbled it down, bar by bar, until he realized it was a melody. Just 4 notes, rising and falling. A signature, Pennington's signature. Across the sea, in his office in London, Pennington stared at his own graph, listening to the feedback loop echoing from the German posts. He smiled faintly. "You heard me, didn't you?" he whispered. "You clever bastard." For the next month, their war became personal. Each night, the soundscape of Europe became a battlefield of tone and countertone. Pennington built new soundscapes, false convoys of bombers that didn't exist, audible illusions drifting across German skies. Weiss countered with triangulation algorithms, detecting the fake harmonics and exposing the ghost fleets. Neither man ever met the other. Yet both began to recognize their opponent's voice. Weiss's signals were mathematical, precise, almost cold. Pennington's an improvisational, like jazz. To the brass on both sides, it was simply intelligence work. To these two men, it was art. In March 1943, the British launched Operation Gomorrah, the firebombing of Hamburg. Weiss's network detected the bombers, but too late. The new British formation emitted no clear tone at all. A perfect silence in the sound spectrum. It was like listening to a symphony where every instrument stopped playing at once. As the bombs fell, Weiss removed his headphones and sat in silence. The duel was over. The British had composed a silence that deafened the Reich. He stood, looking out over the black water of the Channel, and whispered into the static, as if Pennington could hear him. "Well played, maestro." Until August 1943, the air over Europe had gone quiet, but for some, the silence was the loudest sound of all. The fires of Hamburg still smouldered. The city was a wasteland, roofs gone, streets turned to black rivers of ash. To the men of the Reich, it was proof that the sky could betray them. To Dr. Otto Weiss, it was proof that his symphony of sound had been defeated by silence. He sat in a half-collapsed bunker near Bremen, his instruments charred and useless. The delicate microphones he had tuned by hand were nothing more than twisted metal. Static hissed endlessly in the wires like ghosts whispering through the ruins. For weeks he had not slept. He listened not for the bombers, but for anything. The music of war had stopped, yet his ears still heard it. The whine of wind against broken glass became the drone of engines. The drip of melting ice became the slow ticking of Morse code. He rubbed his temples and muttered to himself, "They've stopped playing, but I can still hear them." Across the Channel, in London, Professor Arthur Pennington was not celebrating. The operation had been declared a triumph by the brass. The enemy deafened, the city destroyed. But Pennington's victory tasted bitter. He sat in his small apartment above a record shop in Bloomsbury, staring at the newsprint photographs of Hamburg's ruins. Thousands dead, entire neighborhoods erased. His composition had worked too well. The ministry had awarded him a commendation, a medal he had left unopened on the mantel. To the world, he was a genius. To himself, he was a man who had turned the sky into an instrument of death. That night, unable to sleep, he pulled a sheet of staff paper from his desk and began to write. Not equations, not frequencies. Music? A slow, mournful piece in C minor. He called it The Silence Between Wings. As he wrote, he imagined Weiss, and though he still didn't know the man's name, sitting somewhere in the dark, listening to the same silence. Weiss, meanwhile, had been summoned to Berlin. The corridors of the Air Ministry were colder than ever. Officers in grey uniforms moved like shadows, their faces unreadable. A colonel, expressionless behind a desk, tapped a folder. "Your network failed, Herr Doctor. The Führer demands results, not theories." Weiss replied quietly, "It didn't fail. It evolved. They changed the sky's voice." The colonel sneered. "You mean they tricked you? You, the great listener?" Weiss's jaw tightened. He wanted to explain and to describe how sound could be shaped, how silence itself could deceive. But there was no room for art in a war run by fanatics. When the meeting ended, he left with a small box of personal effects, a compass, a cracked headphone, and one recording he had saved from before the destruction, the faint, musical pulse that had betrayed Pennington's signature. He played it again that night in his quarters. Just 4 notes, barely audible, but to him they were human. The voice of the only other man who had ever understood. In September 1943, the tides of war began to shift. The Allies pushed deeper into occupied Europe, and London's intelligence branch ordered Pennington to adapt his methods again. But Pennington refused. "The system has done its work," he told his superior. "Any further manipulation of sound will bring only more silence." His superior frowned. "You think the Germans won't rebuild their listening network? You think they'll stop?" "No," Pennington said softly, "but maybe I should." The man studied him for a long time. "You've grown sentimental, Professor." Pennington looked out the window at the grey sky above London. "No," he murmured. "Just tired of conducting ghosts." Meanwhile, Weiss was sent east, to Poland. There, in a small town near Krakow, he was tasked with building new detection posts for Luftwaffe night fighters. But every evening, as the snow fell and the distant rumble of the front lines echoed through the fields, he would climb the roof of his quarters and listen. The war was changing tone. The low drone of engines had become the roar of tanks. The mechanical waltz of dogfights had become the slow dirge of retreat. And yet in that noise, Weiss began to hear something else. Fragments of his old recordings. Echoes carried by the wind. It was impossible, of course. The bombers that crossed Poland were different models now, American mostly. But sometimes, just before the raids, he would hear a faint, familiar pattern. 4 notes. The same melody Pennington had sent him across the channel. He didn't tell anyone. He simply listened, tears freezing on his cheeks. In London, months later, Pennington received a sealed letter. Inside was a German document captured by Allied scouts near Krakow. It was a report signed by Dr. Otto Weiss, recovered from a destroyed listening post. Attached to it was a charred strip of magnetic tape, with a faint sound still imprinted. He took it to his gramophone and played it. Through the static came the faint hum of an engine, and beneath it a counter-hum, soft, deliberate. 4 notes, Weiss had answered. Pennington sat motionless, listening to the sound of his rival's final message. It wasn't hatred or defiance. It was acknowledgement, a farewell, written in frequencies. When the record ended, he turned off the machine and whispered, "Goodbye, my friend." By 1945, both men's worlds had ended in different ways. Weiss disappeared in the chaos of Germany's collapse. His body never found, his recordings buried beneath rubble. Pennington lived to see peace, but never returned to the ministry. Instead, he became a quiet lecturer in a small music college in Wales, teaching students how to hear what others ignored, the emotion in noise, the pattern in chaos. And sometimes, on winter nights, he would walk out into the countryside and listen to the distant hum of passing aircraft. Most people heard only engines, but Pennington still heard a symphony. In 12th of May 1946, a year after the guns went silent, the world was still learning how to listen again. The war had ended, but not the echoes it left behind. London was rebuilding, Berlin was divided, and the air, once filled with engines and fire, now carried only the wind. Yet in quiet corners, people were still haunted by the music of what they'd done. Professor Arthur Pennington sat in a dusty lecture hall in Wales, the morning light slanting across rows of empty seats. On his desk lay a wooden box, worn and scarred. Inside it were the fragments of a forgotten war, a cracked headphone, faded staff paper, and that one magnetic strip labelled Weiss Krakow. He still played it sometimes, just to remember. That morning, as he prepared his notes for class, a knock came at the door. A young man entered, a stranger in a dark overcoat, his accent faintly German. "Professor Pennington?" he asked. "Yes," Arthur said cautiously. The man nodded and placed a small parcel on the desk. "My name is Ernst Weiss. I believe you knew my father?" Arthur froze. The air left his lungs. "Your father, Otto?" The young man nodded. He was not a Nazi. He hated them. He said once there was a man across the sea who understood the language of the wind. Before he died, he wanted this sent to him. Arthur opened the parcel with trembling hands. Inside was a small brass tuning fork and a letter written in faded ink. "To the man who changed the sky, I do not know your name, only your sound. When I first heard your frequencies, I thought they were lies. Then I realized they were mercy. You used music to end my work, but also to end my blindness. I learned too late that war is not a symphony. It is silence between screams. If this letter reaches you, know that I forgive you, and I thank you. Otto Weiss." Arthur sat in silence for a long time. His throat burned. The room seemed to tilt around him. He tapped the tuning fork gently on the table. A clear, pure note filled the air. For a moment, it felt like Otto was there. Later that week, Arthur visited London for the first time in years. The city had changed, half rebuilt, half haunted. He went to the old ministry archives, now a dusty basement full of forgotten wartime reports. He searched for records on the Weiss network, but what he found was different. A small file marked Audio Experiments Joint Signal Intercepts 1944. Inside, to his astonishment, was evidence that Allied and German intercepts had, for a brief moment, synchronized. For 2 nights in the winter of 1944, both systems, his and Weiss 8S, had been listening to each other in a perfect loop, the same frequency bouncing across the channel. 2 enemies unknowingly creating harmony. Arthur smiled sadly. We were composing together all along. He returned to Wales that night and began to write. Not a military report, not a paper, a piece of music. He called it the Symphony of Two Skies. It began with the distant hum of engines, low strings, soft percussion, building into the rhythm of flight. Then came the counter-theme, high and delicate, like wind through steel. In the final movement, the 2 themes intertwined. Dissonant at first, then slowly resolving, fading into a single, pure tone, the sound of peace. When he finished, he placed the sheet music in an envelope and mailed it to Ernst Weiss in Munich. Inside he wrote, "Your father was a better composer than I ever was." He wrote with silence. I only translated it. Years passed. The world moved on. New wars began. New skies filled with machines. But the story of the physicist and the music professor remained buried in classified files. Until one day in 1958, during a memorial concert in London, an unknown piece was performed. Symphony of Two Skies. The program listed no composer, only a dedication to those who listened when others only heard. As the music played, the audience sat in stillness. The soft hum of engines echoed through the hall, followed by the rising harmony of strings, a dialogue between sound and silence. Some swore they could hear the wind over Europe, the heartbeat of bombers, and the fragile beauty of peace that followed. When the final note faded, no one clapped. They just sat there, quietly, letting the last frequency dissolve into air. After the concert, a grey-haired man slipped out before anyone could speak to him. He walked through the rain toward the River Thames, his coat collar up, his hands trembling slightly. He paused on a bridge, listening to the distant rumble of traffic. To others, it was noise. To Arthur Pennington, it was still music. He smiled faintly and whispered into the mist, "Good night, Otto." The river answered with silence. But in that silence, somewhere, the sky still sang.